Okay, so last week we began the series of the case for Judaism. We spoke about the concept of why on earth we believe that there's a God and what difference it really makes anyway. Trying to get this a little straighter here. Okay, hope this is all right. So today's topic is taking that a step further and asking the question, all right, so why on earth might I believe that God gave the Torah, right? That's today's topic. I hope this is a good angle. I don't know. That's the topic. And so if we want to start the conversation, all right. So if we want to start that conversation, I think we first need to discuss define two concepts. Define the concept of legend versus history, right? What do we mean by legend versus what do we mean by history, right? Legend can mean a lot of things, but like in the context of like versus history, what do we mean by that? So, there we go. There we go. So I think the conversation begins with, history is what we understand to be like, it's a fact, it's accepted as a fact. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. And we'll be coming back to that phrase a little bit later, right? Now, compared to that, a legend is something that like, hey, it might be true. It might be true. There's such a story. It might be true, might not be true, right? So let's talk a little bit about that. Like, how do we classify something as legend versus how do we classify something as history? But before we do this, is the angle of my camera okay, or is it kind of a little bit off? Naomi, help me out. It is okay? Don't lie to me. It is? Okay, well listen, if Vivian says okay, if the Lighthouse project says it's okay, then I know it's a tip-top shape. Okay, so where do we, so let me give you an example. First and foremost, I'll tell you a little story. Imagine once upon a time, we were standing in the US of A, and we were standing outside of Yankee Stadium, where the New York Yankees play baseball. And imagine they were playing baseball against, my wife's from Toronto, so I like to use the Toronto Blue Jay team. Okay, so imagine they're playing against the Toronto Blue Jays. And imagine you're walking around, imagine you're from Toronto, you're walking around outside there with your Toronto Blue Jays hat, but you weren't at the game, but you see that the game is letting out. All the fans are coming out of the Blue Jays, of the Toronto Blue Jays New York Yankee game. And so you walk up to some guy wearing, Yankee gear, looks like he just came out of Yankee Stadium, you ask him, hey, who won the game? And they say, hey, the Yankees won 5-3. You loser, because he sees you in your Toronto Blue Jays gear. And then you think, all right, listen, it's very well could be that the Yankees won, but like, listen, maybe he's just messing. Maybe really the Blue Jays won. He's just messing with me because he saw me in Toronto Blue Jays, hat and shirt and whatever else. So you say, all right, let me ask somebody else, just to make sure. You walk up to another person. You say, hey, who won the game? And they say, the New York Yankees won. Like they rub it in a little bit. And you say, what's the score? And the guy says, yeah, it was 5-3. So now listen, imagine like you think, okay, listen, it probably 5-3, another person's account is exactly the same. Probably it's true. But like, listen, maybe it's a big coincidence and they're both kind of pulling my leg and they just happen to come across the same score, So you walk up to a third guy, right? So imagine you go to the third guy, a fourth guy, 100th guy, a millionth guy, right? How many people would you need before you start to accept the reality that like, hey, this isn't just a legend that the Yankees beat the Blue Jays, but actually this is history. This is what happened, right? Whatever that amount is, that's not the point. The point here is as things move, right? One thing that, the more witnesses included in the story, the more that story transitions from the status and the classification of legend to the status and classification of history, right? A good example that people like to give is like just George Washington, first president of the United States. Okay, history. Everyone knew about it, right? But for the non-Americans here, there's a story about like George Washington chopping down his father's cherry tree when he was a kid. And, did that happen? Did it not happen? So, that would be more like a legend, right? Why? But what's the difference between George Washington being first president versus George Washington chopping down his father's cherry tree? The difference is the amount of witnesses in the story, right? George Washington, president of the United States, everyone knew about it. George Washington chopping down his father's cherry tree, included in the story is the awareness of 3 to 5 people, maximum 9, 10 people, okay? So again, as more witnesses get included in the story, the more the story transitions from being classified as legend to being classified as history, right? And by the way, in the US of A, during the time when George Washington was president, you know how many people were, according to the statistics, how many people were actually living in the United States of America at that time? Anybody know? Some of you are checking on Wikipedia real quick. 4 million people, that's it. 4 million people, right? And that'll become relevant. And that's, for those who know where we're going with this conversation, that actually becomes very, very relevant. It's very close to another statistic, which we'll talk about later, right? Let me give you that's principle number 1 of legend versus history. Let me give principle number 2 of legend versus history. I want to tell you a little story that happened. Before I came on here, before I put on my screen and unmuted, a wild thing happened to me that I was just sitting here getting ready, and all of a sudden the ceiling opened up and the clouds parted and a light shone down upon me and a voice came out from the heavens. And the voice said to me, Eli, you are the Messiah. Tell all these people who come on tonight to join you in Jerusalem. And together you will storm the Temple Mount and you will take a big Israeli flag and you will plant it there and you will declare that the Messiah has arrived. So who's with me? Do you believe me? So probably you don't, but maybe you do. Maybe I managed to convince some of you. Okay, let me tell you the real story. Let me tell you what really happened. That's not really what happened. Let me tell you what really happened. What really happened was 90 seconds ago, as I was talking to you, anyone here on this stream had the same experience. A ceiling opened up, that parts clouded, a light shone down upon you, and a heavenly voice came out and said, Eli is the Messiah. Go to him in Jerusalem. And we were all there. We're all witness to it. We all saw it happening on each other's screens. We were all there, right? So again, over here, now, do you remember that? Do you remember when that happened? So of course, your answer is no. But there's a difference in these stories. The first story, I can get you, hopefully, if I'm really manipulative and whatever, and you're susceptible, maybe I'll be able to convince you and I'll be able to get you to join me in Jerusalem and storm the Temple Mount and declare me as the Messiah. It's possible, unlikely, but possible. However, the second story is very different. I'm asking you not to believe me. I'm asking you to remember an experience that happened to you, right? And that's the thing. Rule number 2 of legend versus history is that I might get you to believe something happened to me, but I'm not going to be able to get you to believe that something happened to you. Do you hear that? Right? Because if I could come along and tell you that something happened to me, and again, it's legend, but you could choose to believe legend or not. If I'm claiming that something happened to you, that's very different, right? So now, question, is religion legend or is it history? So of course, the next question you want to ask to my question is, well, hold on a second, what religions are we talking about here? All right, let's see, right? Let's see, let's think about how the religions get kicked off, right? So, real Spark Notes version over here real quick, right? Christianity, right? The main story is that you have Jesus, or really it's not about Jesus, it's really more about Paul later on, who really defines what Christianity is today, right? Who basically shares that, Jesus came to him in a vision, and basically we're supposed to follow him, and anyone can join in, not just the Jews. And in short, you're basically being asked to believe Paul's interpretation of what his supposed experience was, right? If you want to go back further, okay, so, you can believe in whatever Jesus has to say, but back then they were really actually quite much closer to observant Jews, truth is, but okay, right? Fast forward a little bit later, we have Muhammad shows up, right? Muhammad, imagine he knocks on your door, and you say, hey, what's up? And he says, my name's Muhammad. And you say, okay, what can I do for you? He says, well, actually, you're supposed to follow me. And you say, really? I'm supposed to follow you? How am I supposed to, why should I believe that? And he said, well, God told me to tell you, right? Again, a person can choose to believe him or not. Or you can come, or maybe Muhammad will show up with a sword and say, follow me, or I'm going to chop off your head. That's another story, right? But point is that if you take those origins, right, and you can also go, by the way, you can also go to other religions or traditions, Buddhism or other things, where there it's not even a God claim necessarily. It's not a God claim. It's people who have certain experiences, but even there, that's not even a God claim. But anyway, bring it over to Judaism, right? In Judaism, the origin story of Judaism is very different. People think it's the same, right? A lot of people out there think that, like, okay, so like Moses was on top of the mountain and he had some experience that God spoke to him and yada, yada. And so it's the same thing. But no, Judaism's claim was never that, right? Judaism's claim, and what separates Judaism from all the other belief systems, is that Judaism comes along and says, no, the origin kickoff claim of Judaism is that God spoke to the entire Jewish nation. God had some kind of communication, revelation with the entire Jewish nation. And then that was an incredible experience. And then Moses goes up and gets the Torah from Hashem. And it's not just about Moses getting the Torah, quite the opposite. It's about the fact that there was that God gave over the roots of the Torah, the concept of the first couple of commandments, the concept of the positive commandments, and the negative commandments, the thou shalt and the shalt nots, the Anochi Hashem Elokecha, the I am Hashem your God who took you out of Egypt, right? That God gives over to the entire Jewish people, and that's separate. And not only does that, stamp a huge difference about Judaism, but also that shows that Moshe is legitimate, right? And by the way, it wasn't just the God giving the Torah to the Jewish people. That wasn't the only thing that the entire nation saw, right? You're talking about the 10 plagues. You're talking about the splitting of the sea. You're talking about manna falling from heaven for 40 years, right? So this is entirely, this kickoff story of Judaism, the origin claim of Judaism, completely different from all the other claims that are out there, right? Because people will now come along and ask, and totally legitimate questions. Well, hold on a second, right? And these are like the 3 what ifs that I like to bring up, right? What if God never showed up really at the Mount Sinai, and Moshe really just came down with the Torah, but really that whole story never happened? So, good question, but the answer is very simple. Right? Imagine Moses comes down the mountain, and the people say, "Oh, Moses, what's up? What's that thing you got under your arm?" And he says, "Oh, this scroll. Oh, these tablets, right? This is the Torah." And they say, "Wow, that's amazing. What's in it?" Well, they say, "God gave us a whole bunch of commandments in here, a whole way to live life." And you say, "Wow, that's really God gave it to us." And then you crack it open, you read. And it's like, and there, right there in the Torah, it says, well, hold on a second. Moses, 40 days ago, it says here that we were all at the mountain and God spoke to all of us. Moses, this never happened. See? Problem with the kickoff. of Judaism, if you want to suggest that, right? I'll give you another example. People also ask, well, hold on a second. What if someone invented the whole story later on? Imagine 300 years later, someone came out with a scroll from their tool shed and everyone said to them, hey, what's that? And they said, whoa, this is a Torah. It's awesome. It's got history. It's got ways of life. It's got traditions. And you say, wow, all right, let's take a look. And they crack it open. And once again, it says, dude, 300 years ago, it says here that all of our ancestors were at a place called Sinai and they all witnessed God speak to them. That's amazing. But like, why are you the only one with a record of this, right? And not only that, this person is trying to get me to take on a whole way of life based on a claim that he's claiming happened to my parents or my great-grandparents, right? And everyone else is here great-grandparents. And why is he the only one who ever heard anything about it? Not only that, by the way, we don't have a record of such a person. You'd think the person who reintroduced Judaism to the Jewish people would be, we would have heard of such a person, but of course we have no record of such a story, right? One more what if that people like to ask is, what if really everyone was at Mount Sinai and Moses knew how to summon the aliens, or he knew how to, Moses managed to trick everyone into thinking that really it was God. He somehow managed to put on a fireworks show and get everyone to think that it was God. So, what about that? So that's a great question. Well, some people actually say it's a ridiculous question, but let's assume it's a great question, right? So the thing is, though, if you crack open the Torah itself says that at any point you can look back, at any point in history, you'll be able to look back and ask yourself the question of, did anyone ever make this claim? This claim of a national revelation of God speaking to an entire nation of people and live to tell about it. Right? It's in Deuteronomy chapter 4 at the end. Right? Because after all, if Moses can pull it off, you'd think he'd be wise enough to realize that someone else might be able to pull it off in the future as well. And if someone else pulls it off, and it says in his Torah that there'll never be such a claim, you're undermining the authenticity of your Torah. If you open the door for it being undermined, if someone else comes along and manages to pull off the same feat that you pulled off by tricking a whole nation of people into thinking they experienced God. Right? And yet, Moshe goes ahead, or God goes ahead, and puts it in the Torah. Right? What that's telling you is that whoever put the Torah out there was pretty confident that they know what's going to be in the future, that they, basically that they control what's going to be in history. And by the way, here we are thousands of years later, and if you look back, you find that there are over 15,000 religions, cults, splinter groups of splinter groups throughout the world and throughout history. And there is only one that makes the claim of a national revelation of God as its kickoff argument for authenticity, and that's the Jews. And by the way, you'd think that everyone would want to make that argument, because clearly it's a much stronger argument for the truth of something if we can say that an entire nation had a God experience as opposed to just one person or a cluster of a few people, right? Clearly that's the claim. If you were kicking off a religion, clearly that's the claim that you would want to make. It's a much stronger argument. So you'd think that other people would have tried to pull it off, or maybe been successful pulling it off, but you can't be successful pulling it off for the reasons that I just shared, right? It would never get started. And so people ask the question, hold on a second, Naomi, you have a question? Yeah, I saw a hand raised a while ago. Oh, you might have to be able to chat it. I don't know if you can unmute. Vivian, can we unmute her? Okay, I guess we can't. Oh, we can. Here it comes. There you are.
Okay. Just a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Again, like with the first question I had. Yes? Okay. So the first question I had was, how many people were there exactly that witnessed the revelation? I forgot the number. And then another question is, the Jewish people had the revelation at Mount Sinai, but the actual Torah, like the 5 books, they didn't receive at Mount Sinai. They got it later, right? When they were wandering through the desert, Moses was writing down like the book. How do we know that this is true? Like we didn't witness it all. Like not
Very good.
everybody of us witnessed that. It was really just himself. And how can we trust Moses that he actually wrote down something that God told him to write down? And then in general, after getting the Torah, we had prophecies, we had like like single people witnessed something and had a conversation with God, and it's written down in Tanakh. How do we know exactly that this actually happened? Because we haven't been there, like if we claimed it. So it's for later on. How do we know that it's all true?
Very good. Well done. Okay, very good. Firstly, the answer to the question number 1 is approximately 3 million people, which is why I thought it was interesting when I discovered George Washington, first president of the United States, well-known national, the entire nation knows about it, and it's 4 million people. Very, very close. Very close. So it's interesting. So 3 million, about approximately 3 million Jews were there. 3 million people were there. That's question number 1. Question number 2, I actually was hinting to that. I was hinting to that, the answer to that question a little bit earlier when I was sharing with you that when God communicates with the entire Jewish nation, this is a stamp of approval on Moshe, that Moshe is legitimate, that everything he's been telling them up until that point is real. I mean, the truth is they witnessed the 10 plagues, so it wasn't like it was such a big question mark. But that is the final stamp of approval that when Moshe is giving over, is legit, is from God, is real. And based on that, we have the principle of essentially of what Moshe is giving us over is real and is from God. And so based on that principle, yes, a certain amount of the Torah is given over at Mount Sinai, up till wherever they were up to in history, right? And then moving forward from there throughout the times in the desert, yes, Moshe continues to have this high level of prophecy and adds and continues to add in the Torah based on what God tells them. And again, the reason why we understand this to be authentic is based on how this process got kicked off with Moshe getting that stamp of approval on Hashem. Now, based on that, we also share that also what was given over to Moshe within the Torah, and this is spoken about in the Torah, this is spoken about in the Talmud, as clarified as well throughout the Talmud, is that there is a system by which, in order to be considered to be a legitimate prophet, an authentic prophet, there were certain tests that people needed to go through in front of like the Sanhedrin and things like this, the Jewish High Court, in order to be considered a legitimate prophet and not a false prophet, right? And it's discussed in the Torah and further fleshed out in the Talmud what the intent of the Torah has been. And that's going to be next week's class, by the way. Next week's class is going to be, okay, how do we know that the oral tradition is legit and relevant? We're going to talk about that next week, God willing. But that was also put out there. And so, yeah, there were definitely people who tried to become false prophets and were ultimately disproven. Also, by the way, just to be clear, there were prophets there were prophets galore back in the day. The ones that we have writings of in the Tanakh were prophets that had something that was relevant for the ultimate future, relevant for the entirety of the generations to come. That's what's included in Tanakh. But the truth is that back in the day, there were many people who were able to achieve prophecy. And so it's like, okay, you want to know who your bashert is? You go to your local prophet around the corner and he'll tell you who you should marry. It was like that. It was like that at certain times in Jewish history. And so that means to say, though, that any person who was like that, in order to be, again, considered to be legitimate and not a phony and someone who's trying to infiltrate, a person, got the stamp of approval from Jewish High Court, which followed certain guidelines as to how to clarify whether someone is a legitimate prophet or not a legitimate prophet. So that's the answer to that. So moving right along. So the next question that we can ask is, so why don't people, if we have such a strong basis, a strong story, a history. Why don't people believe God? Why do people find it difficult to believe the story that God gave the Torah to the Jewish people? And so to this, I begin to wonder what would happen if we can separate ourselves from our psychological blockings, from our resistance, right? Because I think there are a couple of factors that I want to share with you, right? I think one factor, and what stops people from jumping in, is let's be rational about this, they'll say, right? The idea that if I can't see it, it isn't real, right? The idea of seeing is believing. And so people will say, hold on a second, this whole God thing, it's a non-starter. It's a non-starter, especially when we're talking about God's involvement with people and whatever. It's a non-starter for a lot of people. Why? Because they've bought into seeing is believing, right? So I would like to share that we find that nowadays nobody accepts seeing is believing. We've already rejected it, but people don't realize it. They just move the yardstick. They move the yard post, right? Because think about it. Back in the day, there was a guy named Dr. I always forget his name, Ignaz, I don't know how to pronounce it, Ignaz Semmelweis. Anyone ever heard of him? I always forget his name. Ignaz Semmelweis. You probably have heard the story and you just don't remember the name. He was a doctor, I believe in Germany, and he had a theory. He would go from dealing with bodies in the morgue to delivering babies, and he figured out that, well, he wanted to figure out why it was that people, in his office or in the hospital, different things, why people, at the beginning, the more he'd go throughout the day, he'd see that he'd have more success towards the beginning of his day than the end of his day, right? So he decided, I'm going to repeat my routine. I'm going to repeat my routine for the beginning, between each patient. And then as he did, he saw that these patients from later in the day started to have a better healing process, started to match the ones from the beginning of the day. And so anyway, he came up with a hypothesis because, the different things that he did, he came up with a hypothesis, and he believed that there are these small things on your hands that you can't see with your eyes. I believe nowadays we call them viruses, right? And that by washing your hands, you are somehow going to be able to rinse yourself of certain things and open the door for more cleanliness, and these things that can get in the way and cause problems and cause illnesses are going to be washed away. And so people of his time thought he was crazy. It's like, oh, you're one of those energy people, man. That's how they related to him, to the point that they put him they didn't like what he was saying, and they put him into an insane asylum, and I think they also hired people to beat him up or something. And so anyway, he died in that insane asylum. Of course, now we call this science. What changed? Well, one thing that changed is we developed something called a microscope, right? And now I look at this thing in front of me, this table in front of me, and as much as I see it and feel it and perceive it as being solid, now science tells me, no, most of it's empty space, and the amount of matter that's actually there can fit underneath your fingertip, under your fingernail. Well, hold on a second. What happened to seeing is believing? Well, very simple. What happened was that apparently my perceptions and my ability to see isn't the end-all be-all of reality. So it turns out that science has actually shown us that seeing is not believing. The only problem was that I didn't have the vehicle, the tool to physically see what was really going on, what was really there, right? So after we discover this, it takes quite a leap of faith and a very strong closed mind to not be able to consider the idea that there's something that's outside the reach of my physical capacity to perceive it, right? Namely spirituality, God, right? Especially in this physical world where already there are things in the physical domain that we are clearly acknowledging that we don't have the ability to perceive them. So all the more so can't we be open to the possibility that there is something that's beyond the physical that we don't have the tool to perceive at this moment? And maybe we'll never have the tool to perceive physically, right? But even the physical world is showing us that all of our perceptions are true on one level of perception, but we're missing all sorts of other very real layers of perception. So what we're seeing, right? If I think that this desk in front of me is simply this desk in front of me, so that's incorrect. So seeing is believing. We've already shown that that's to be limited to that is a falsehood, right? So that's the answer to that objection, right, that people have, and we have to take that in, right? The entire world of microorganisms could not be seen, yet it's very real, right? Okay, objection number 2 that people like to have that makes the whole idea of Judaism, religion, spirituality, God, a non-starter for people is, right? The first one was, let's be rational about this, right? The second one is, let's not get emotional about this, right? That people like to make the claim that, people get into religions because it's more comfortable. The comfort it brings, right? The community, meaning in suffering, life after death, like it's warm and fuzzy, like it makes you feel like you don't need, like everything's okay, you know? However, if a person wants to be real about it, you'd have to also acknowledge that also people avoid getting involved in Judaism or Torah or religion for the quote unquote wrong reasons, right? Meaning, like, let's be honest, a lot of times people are not involved, not because of some real philosophical difficulty that they have, but it's more about, I'm not going to be able to do whatever I feel like doing whenever I feel like doing it, right? And it's got nothing to do with, the philosophical belief system of Judaism or any particular belief system out there, right? So we should be able to, if we want to be thinking open, real, objective, honest people, we should be able to acknowledge that, yes, people could get involved in Judaism or to any religion for the quote unquote wrong reasons. But we also have to be real that people could avoid Judaism or any religion for the quote unquote wrong reasons, right? But that shouldn't take away from the fact that those of us who do want to be open, objective, honest, real, truth-seeking, real people should be able to proceed with the conversation in an open and dignified and respectful way. Okay, so once we've addressed all these things, typically the question now gets a little bit deeper, which is more like, well, hold on a second. How can you really know? How can you know for sure? Which then evolves to, how can you really know anything for sure? And then, of course, it gets to, how do I even know I exist for sure, right? And so, the answer to that is that when someone asks to that extent, how could you know any of this for sure? The answer to that is you're right. You can't, in the way you're talking about knowing for sure, you're right. You can't know it for sure, just like you can't know that you're even here for sure, right? Maybe we're all in some machine and we were all created 3 minutes ago and something's operating our brain and making us think and feel like we're really here, And for this, I go back to that idea of being beyond we have to live beyond a reasonable doubt, not beyond a shadow of a doubt, right? Perhaps this is why the American court system works with those phrases, right? They say in order for someone to show that someone's guilty, you have to bring evidence that they're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, not beyond a shadow of a doubt, right? Because beyond a shadow of a doubt would be like, okay, hold on a second, maybe that DNA was just like, showed up there somehow, like maybe aliens came and put it there, like you can always have that. So that's why, again, we have to go with beyond a reasonable doubt. And the point that I want to share here is why the double standard? Why do people go to this argument? Like, you never make this argument before any other decision in your life, right? You never use this line of reasoning when it comes to, you know, what job you're going to go to, what school you're going to go to, crossing the street, right? You hold by cause and effect when it comes to, you know, beyond a reasonable doubt, right? Like, I'm probably not going to get hit by a car if I cross the street because I look both ways before I cross the street, instead of crossing the street with a bag over my head, with a brown bag over my head, right? They used to have brown bags back in the day. I don't know if they still have them, but right? Because why? Because I understand that there's certain rational procedures in this world, the way the world functions. If it was beyond a shadow of a doubt, so why even, if it's functioning like that and just things just pop out of it, in and out of existence randomly, and so you wouldn't need to look both ways before you go to the street, right? Same thing over here. We never use this line of reasoning making decisions in life, deciding if something is real, deciding what I want to do. That's not, why apply a completely different standard when it comes to Judaism, when it comes to Torah, from anything else in life that you do, right? And so it's important to recognize this, right? And this point was made so clear, this entire point of this principle of, you know, everything we're sharing here, is legend and history and all that, was made so clear to me one time when I was at a certain a talk by a particular rabbi. And he shared the point that, like, you know, how are we in 50 years from now, 100 years from now, how are we going to be able, how are we or our kids or grandkids going to know, let's call it the grandkids of our grandkids, going to know that the Holocaust happened, right? So you might say, well, hold on a second, there's all this evidence. Really? Well, you know, the Holocaust denial is growing and growing, you know? So you're going to say, okay, well, there's video footage, there's this, there's that. It's like, that's already here. And today we still have people walking around with the numbers on their arm, and still they want to say that it's made up or it's over exaggerated. Or so if that's going on now, in 100, 150 years from now, how are our grandkids going to know that the Holocaust happened the way we talk about how it happened? And there's only one answer to that question. And that is the same answer as how we know God gave the Torah to the Jewish people: national revelation. The fact that any Ashkenazi Jew, literally 98% probably of Ashkenazi Jewry out there, comes from someone who was at the Holocaust, who witnessed, who was affected by the Holocaust, right? And so there's going to be the stories that are passed down with that. And there's going to be the fact that everyone and their neighbor and their community, everyone knows about the Holocaust, and everyone has some kind of connection to it. And even if they don't personally have a connection to it, 99% of people around them do have the connection to it, right? And so in the same manner, this is how we know, unfortunately, you could say it's unfortunate, but this is how we're going to have to know that the Holocaust happened, is because national revelation, right? Same as the way we know that God gave the Torah to the Jewish people. Again, you want to call it not beyond a shadow of a doubt, that's fine. Beyond a reasonable doubt, everything, once we make the case for it, we see, as long as you take away, if you can take away your bias of the fact that we're talking about something happening beyond the natural laws, right? It's a bigger leap of faith to believe that it didn't happen than to believe that it did. And that's really the way I think we answer the question. Now, there's all sorts of other things, you know, proofs, things in the Torah wrote, and then like prophecies that were unlikely, and then they came up. We see now historically that it happened. And yes, we can go down that route. There's people who do that. There's classes on that. That's not my intent here today. My intent here today is to go from the heart of the matter, right? Which is, and this is how we can get into really answering the question, why, like we started this class with, why believe God gave the Torah? What the rationale that we can go ahead and take. Okay, questions, thoughts, ideas before we call it here. Okay, let's stop here for now. And Bezrat Hashem, God willing, thank you so much for joining. And wait, do you want to ask something, Naomi? Go ahead, let's unmute her.
You talked about having good reasons to be religious, and I just wanted to ask you what would be good reasons for you to become religious? Like it,
No, so
I had
what I
once a conversation, this is why I wrote Opium for the People, that people start to become religious sometimes because they were not in a good environment, they didn't have good experiences, and then there comes religion and they see, wow, such nice people. Oh, Shabbat is really nice. Like I really want to be connected to like these kind of people. And while other people would say this is like opium for the people, like it just makes you feel good, it's easy, it makes you like able to deal with your problems. Like they judge it in a negative way. So then like what's your look on that? Like why people should become religious in the first place?
right. So look, from the perspective, let's say like this: the perspective we're taking here is a very rational perspective, right? Which is like, look, if this is true, makes sense to get in. Makes sense to get in. What's more important than figuring out what is real, right? And why? Because then I can figure out I want to be attached to, I want to live my life in the, the best way possible, right? I want to live my life in the best way possible. I live my life in accordance with what is, in accordance with truth, right? So that's the case we're making here, right? And so according to that, we would say, yeah, I'm trying to share that, like, look, it's nice if people start getting attracted to Judaism and to Torah and whatever based on certain positive things they see. But in the end of the day, at some point, people have to, I believe anyone who's a thinking person has to grapple with this question. Because there's going to be a day when it's not, there's going to come a time or a day in a person's life where, or just come even a certain episode where it's just like, you know what, Judaism is telling me to do one thing and I don't feel like doing that, or that's going to be difficult for me, right? And there's going to be like, okay, it's not all going to be, unicorns and butterflies all the time, right? And so then it's like, okay, hold on a second. Is this real? Or is this just about making me feel good, right? At some point, that inspiration, that high, that has to come down at some point, just like in any relationship, right? The guy and the gal, they meet, they don't know each other. It's love at first sight, fireworks, blah, 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 right? And they're on a high. At some point, you come down from that high, and then it's just like, okay, hold on a second. Do I want to really build this relationship? Or am I going to decide, forget it, the hell with it, right? So now here with Judaism, it's a little bit different, because here it's like, okay, hold on, is this real? Or is this just like, okay, whenever it feels high, I feel like in a good mood, I'll do it. And whenever not, I'll go back to living, my non-Jewish or my non-observant life or whatever, right? So then, okay, so what is that? Okay, good. I'm happy that the person's attracted to something. I'm happy the person's connecting to something. But like, really, what is that at the end of the day, And so a real relationship, a real connection, and also if you want to be a truth seeker, which is really the conversation we're having here, is going to have to be to go beyond, it feels nice and fluffy. And then at some point ask myself, now look, at some point ask myself these questions and go, start learning and start thinking. So look, I'm all for, nice, cozy, comfy Shabbat meals and showing people a good thing and showing people a healthy family and a healthy scene and people who are growing together. I'm all for that. But that's great. But then at some point though, there does need to be moving past that, which is like, okay, hold on a second. Is this real? Is this something that I'm going to like build my life around this because this is true? Or is it just something that like, when I'm feeling high, I'll go do this. And then I leave the Shabbat dinner and I check out, Is that fair? Okay. Cool. Other questions, thoughts, ideas, my friends? All right. I thank you for joining me. God willing, next week, we will go on to talk about the next core belief in Judaism, which is why believe that the oral tradition is legit and relevant. Stay tuned. God willing, I will see you then.